We the people of the Patriots' cause do appreciate your service. Have you heard that conscience is the most sacred of all property? James Madison, such a complicated man, loved his country and yet wrote articles against the sitting President of the United States, a war hero, founder of our country, George Washington himself. Now, I believe this is what is known as loyal opposition. The armed protectors of the Constitution despise this principle, and yet here we are, loyal Americans opposing a dictatorship. Does your conscience understand the innocent lives that your work is saving? I certainly hope it does.
The Great Depression was an economically and physically devastating time for the United States. It had huge human costs, and those costs were felt individually throughout the United States. Herbert Hoover did little late 1920s, early 1930s to help alleviate that individual human suffering. So by the time of the 1932 election, Americans were really looking for somebody that would help them out. And Franklin Roosevelt came along promising to use the power of the government to help solve these problems. They elected Roosevelt, and he immediately initiated a series of programs for relief and recovery. Relief meaning just ending the suffering, and recovery meaning getting the economy back in order. Later on, this is going to be called the New Deal. It's a new deal for society, and there are some issues with it. It's very complicated, it's very controversial, and in the modern environment, especially conservatives will look at this and talk about the New Deal as implementing a welfare state. Some would like to argue that this is the implementation of socialism in the United States, but we need to be careful with that because socialism is this effort for the public body, the government, to overtake all of the means of production, control all the factories. What Roosevelt did slide the United States on that socialist spectrum, but is by no means an effort to implement socialism or communism within the United States. Things like Social Security are government programs created during the New Deal that did help out individuals using the power of the government to help out. In fact, many historians have argued that had it not been for the New Deal, for the Roosevelt's efforts, then capitalism within the country may have ended, and we would have had a fascist or totalitarian dictatorship like in the European countries. The New Deal overview is one of relief, recovery, and reform. When Franklin Roosevelt took office, his immediate response was to try to provide relief and recovery to the suffering American public. And to some extent, this recovery and this relief did help. There was some relief, there was some additional assistance brought on, but the New Deal doesn't really solve the Great Depression. What does solve the Great Depression is that massive government spending during World War II, which is interesting because during the Great Depression, an argument had always been that government spending would just increase the deficit and the debt, and it would wreck the economy. But now we spent about $40 billion over the entire Great Depression, 8 years during the New Deal in government spending. During World War II, is about $400 billion. So massive government spending during World War II. And there is some reform effort that does prevent future crashes all the way up until 2008 with the Great Recession. We didn't have a depression of that magnitude for 60, 70 years. So we have these three R's: relief, recovery, and reform. We'll talk about an example of relief being something like the WPA, where the government provided jobs for people. Something in the matter of recovery, which would have been something like the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which got young men out of the cities, gave them jobs, they could send money back home. There's other recovery efforts like the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. We'll talk about those more later. And then reform, actually changing the system so another crash doesn't occur. And this is something like the FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, which was an effort to try to help banks from crashing again.
There has been an unexpected occurrence. Our schedule has been pushed up. The information is still vital, so we need you to continue with the procurement of the details. We must make an effort to obtain the device soon.
One of Franklin Roosevelt's Roosevelt's initial concerns upon taking office in 1932 was the bank and stock industry. His initial goal was to stabilize the economy enough so that it could recover, and then with the recovery, a lot of the human suffering that was taking place would be alleviated. So he closed the banks. Now, this is a counterintuitive step, but he forced the banks to go on holiday for a matter of a couple of weeks. And while the banks were closed, this would prevent the bank runs. And if the people couldn't run on the bank and take all the deposits out, then they would be able, the banks wouldn't crash. And when the banks reopened, they would be able to loan out money. They would stimulate the economy by promoting small businesses to be created, to give people new jobs and the like. Now, while the banks were closed, he wasn't just hoping that that people would trust them again. He went through and he had investigators go into each of the banks and determine who were the good banks and which were the bad banks. The bad banks would be closed. The good banks would be given a little symbol, a little seal to show that they were government approved as being legitimate. He also went on to the radio, and while he was on the radio, we call these the fireside chats. This is one of the first times in history the president could talk directly to the people nationwide at one time. So while using this new technology of the radio, he's talking to the people and laying out his plan step by step and telling the people why they should be able to trust the banks again. Once the banks reopened, the panic was eased. The panic subsided. People were putting their money back into the bank. They had help with this because the government also put its weight behind the banks. It used its power, its money power, in order to help stabilize the economy through the creation of the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Depending on how much money at the time, the government would insure a certain amount of each deposit. At the time, it was something like $2,000 or $3,000. So if you had up to that amount of money in the bank closed, the government would refund you the money. This meant that people didn't have to run on the bank because their money was insured. So this helped promote more stability, and banking runs fell way off after this was implemented. Roosevelt also wanted to regulate the stock market. Remember the buying on margin issue. So Roosevelt wanted to prevent the conditions that caused the crash in the first place, mostly that unregulated stock market. So during the New Deal, they created the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, to try to prevent those conditions that caused the crash of the stock market in the first place. So stabilizing the economy to promote the recovery, which would then end the human suffering. During the Great Depression, Roosevelt argued that we should use money in order to make money. See, the government can borrow money at very low rates. And what Roosevelt argued was that we can spend money, but we can't waste citizens' lives. So he argued that we should use deficit spending, which means borrowing money. The government borrows money in order to what he called prime the pump. Now, this would have been an analogy that all the farmers would have understood. When you build a well, the water is deep underground. And if you just keep pumping the handle, nothing's going to happen because there's air there. So you have to actually put water into the tube going down into the well before the water will come up the well. So what Roosevelt argues is that we needed to put money into the economy before the money could start flowing again. In other words, we needed to use deficit spending to stimulate the economy. Because the government can borrow at low rates, he argued that this wouldn't be too much of a burden for the government. At the time, a lot of his critics said that this was wasteful spending. During the entire New Deal, the government only borrowed about $40 billion, which seems like a whole lot of money. But during World War II, which is credited with ending the Great Depression, the government ends up deficit spending about $400 billion. So we can see that, yes, the government spending was rather important in ending the Great Depression.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, it looks right. So 10. Red is telling me that her contacts are telling her that the cause has picked up something big. They ransacked the Lieutenant Governor's mansion and nearly captured Government Duke's right-hand man, Lieutenant Governor Connors. Rumor is they made off with an encryption relay transponder. Red says she's hearing that Connor had locked up the transponder in a Rube Goldberg-type contraption. Now look, I'm not a fan of the PC, but that is a great piece of tech. I'd suggest you try to help me get it.
During the Great Depression and the New Deal era, farmers certainly were suffering. This is a struggle that had started all the way back in the 1920s. If you remember, even before the Great Depression, about 25% of farms had been foreclosed on either due to debt or tax issues. The Great Depression era also saw a continuation of the falling crop prices, and a lot of this had to do with supply and demand. All of that agricultural technology and all the efforts of farmers to make up the difference in their loss of income by planting more crops really meant that there's an increase in the supply, which drove the prices down. So in an attempt to overcome the law of supply and demand, what the government did was pay farmers to not grow crops. This would reduce the supply available, which would increase the price of those crops. See, it's very interesting is that while people were starving in the cities, and we'll talk about soup kitchens, there was so much abundance in the countryside that farmers were actually not even harvesting their crops because it was cheaper to just let them rot in the field. So if the government could convince farmers not to grow crops, it would lower the supply. Demand being the same, it would increase the price for those crops. And this did have some effect. It did stabilize agricultural prices. Incomes did go up on the farms. It's an effort, both relief and recovery. It's such a popular program that there's still versions of it today. Even in the modern era, farmers are paid not to grow certain crops. However, during the 1920s, this does hurt a large population, mostly of minority farmers. Those sharecroppers in the South who were paying off their debts by growing crops, all of a sudden their land is out of production. The tenant owner does not want their crops anymore, so they're really out of luck. Also, tenant farmers who were paying off their debts by selling their crops also lost out as well. This disproportionately hurts the minority population, whereas those former landowning families tended to be the white farmers in the South and Midwest. This is called the Agricultural Adjustment Act, by the way, the AAA. Job creation was a very important part of the New Deal effort. Industrial employment at the height of the Great Depression was somewhere around 40%, if you factor out all of the farm workers and such. So the need to create jobs is very important. So a lot of the programs that Roosevelt proposed were designed to stimulate job growth. Some of it was designed to help private industries grow, but for the most part, when we talk about the New Deal programs, they're typically government jobs that were created in order to provide relief and then further recovery to the economy. For example, you have the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. This was a rural electrification program. Now, the government did provide jobs to build dams throughout all of Tennessee. There was criticism of this, but for the most part, these jobs were providing electricity in areas that previously hadn't had electricity. This is done for a couple of different reasons. First of all, to give jobs to the people that were working there, but also, if you're providing electricity, people are going to have to buy products to go with that electricity. So it's creating a whole new group of consumers, a whole new market for factories that want to produce things. It's increasing the demand, plus it's giving them a job. So you have these government paychecks as well as these new consumers available to increase demand. And if there's an increase in demand, that means that more is going to be produced. And if more is being produced, that increases the need for workers. So this is both a relief project as well as a recovery project. There's also the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Here in Myrtle Beach, a lot of our parks along the beach were actually created by the CCC. The CCC was a program that typically gave young, mostly white, mostly inner city or suburban dwellers jobs by sending them into national parks and other areas to create parks, public parks. This is done for a couple of reasons as well. First, they were given $30 a month, and 29 of that had to be sent back home. So first of all, the second reason is you're getting those young youth that are unemployed out of the city, out of these dense locations where they can just cause problems. There are other programs that were created by the government. Jobs were created by having people build schools, hospitals, bridges, airports. And lastly is the WPA. Now there's others as well, but the one more important ones here, the Works Progress Administration. The government argued that we don't want to lose our culture simply because we have a Great Depression. Writers, artists, painters, they're all important. All those people were sent out, given government jobs to go out and document the Great Depression and paint and write and do all that other stuff.
So 10. Look, if you're out there and I'm pretty sure you're getting these, we know the Cincinnatus has you. We're working on getting you out of there. Now look, this is not an ideal situation, but for as blustery as Cincinnatus is, just do the work he's given you. We hope that we'll get you a direct line to us soon. Hang tight. You're doing great.
There's a number of criticisms of the New Deal from both the left, the liberal side, and the right, the conservative side. Starting with the liberal critics, the left critics, they argued that the New Deal didn't do enough. Typically, these were workers who were struggling and labor unions. This is a working class issue. And what they wanted was more redistribution of the wealth. Now, it's a misconception that there were no wealthy people during the Great Depression. There were. The ones that were able to hold on through the stock market actually made a lot of money off of it. What typically the liberal critics wanted was more support for the elderly and the poor. Today, what we'd call the social safety net. There was one plan out there that wanted to take all of the money and income that people made over I think it was $1,000, take all of it and redistribute it to anybody making less than that, so that everybody could have a guaranteed $1,000 income. That is on the severe end of on the scale. None of those plans were all that feasible, but the point is that the New Deal had critics on the left-hand side that wanted more government action, and Roosevelt was trying to stay away from that excess. Labor unions were also demanding collective bargaining rights. They argued that if they had collective bargaining rights by law, that they were protected. Remember, those protections had gone away during the laissez-faire 1920s under the Republican administrations. They wanted those collective bargaining rights back from the, say, progressive era, that they would be able to negotiate their own contracts with the factories, which were now experiencing demand because of these new government programs that were stimulating the economy. So critics on the left, the liberal critics, wanted the government to do more. There were critics of the New Deal on the right. These tended to be conservative critics. Often they were wealthy businessmen who didn't like the idea that the New Deal was spending a lot of money or was promoting wealth redistribution because it was their wealth that was going to be redistributed. They were also concerned that it was a program that was overtly socialist. This was not the capitalist country that they had been raised in. Again, that's overblown. There's no pure communism, socialism, there's no pure capitalism, but what the New Deal did was slide us a little bit further on the scale of socialism, but by no means was it in any way a government takeover of any programs. They did accuse Roosevelt of making the federal government too powerful, getting too far involved in people's lives, but that was actually a feature that people had voted for Franklin Roosevelt for. They wanted somebody to step in and help them out. He was accused of making the executive branch too powerful, which was probably one of the more valid criticisms of Roosevelt. We're going to see this in the court packing scheme. He did try to put a lot of power into the executive branch and into the presidency. They went a little overboard in calling him a European-style fascist, a totalitarian, almost dictator. This was not an unfair criticism for the time period, in that there were a lot of democracies that were falling into that trap of fascism. Nazi-era Germany being probably the most obvious, which was a democracy which actually elected Adolf Hitler. There were only 2 capitalist democracies left in the world by the time the World War II hits. Many of the conservatives in 1920, many of the presidents had appointed conservative Supreme Court justices as well. So these critics of the New Deal, many of them were sitting on the Supreme Court, and they did overrule some early New Deal programs, which led further credence into the criticisms on the right. They said that they were unconstitutional. This is going to lead to the court packing scheme and eventually the court being put under the thumb of Roosevelt to some extent. The biggest criticism, though, was probably the government's deficit spending. There was a concern that too much deficit spending by the government would bankrupt the nation. It would cause our economy to really go into a tailspin. Again, there's some legitimacy to this in that people are watching what had happened to Germany and their hyperinflation issues during the 1920s and early 1930s. But the government spending that was there did help to ease this suffering. It did end the spiraling of the economy and did help to, if not end the New Deal, at least make it tolerable among the population.
Well now, I do believe you were called 10. You know, one time it was believed that knowing a person's name gave one power over them. That may be true, but now 10 isn't your name, is it? You have some social friends. We thought we had neutralized your collective for a time. Of course, I've had interactions with your leader in the past. I always thought him weak, unwilling to do what was necessary. And yet, he's not willing to sacrifice you. Is that weakness, do you think? I need to reflect on this. For now, do show your worth, and we may have more interesting conversations soon.
One of the criticisms of Franklin Roosevelt that went across party lines, we'd call it bipartisan, both the liberals and the conservatives were frustrated by it, is referred to as the court packing scheme. If you remember, the Supreme Court overturned a number of Roosevelt's early New Deal policies, and Franklin Roosevelt had the legislature on his side. He also wanted the Supreme Court on his side. So he came up with this scheme to try to add 6 new justices to the Supreme Court. This would increase the number of justices from 9 to 15. Now, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that there is a certain number of judges on the Supreme Court. So constitutionally, this actually isn't necessarily against the rules. However, this was such a blatant act to try to get the Supreme Court on his side that both the left and the right were critical of it. Because if he's adding these 6 new justices, he would get to appoint them, which means they would be loyal to him and his New Deal policies. Now, Roosevelt argued that there were 6 justices over the age of 70 on the Supreme Court, and they were slow and they needed help to process the information. But that was such a transparent act that everybody understood what he was really up to. Overall, his court packing scheme fails. It makes him look very bad. In fact, it led to that criticism that he was trying to gain, if not too much power for the executive branch, that he was trying to become a dictator. I doubt that that's really what he was trying to do, but it does lead to that criticism. In the end, though, it apparently worked because the Supreme Court didn't overturn any more of his New Deal policies after that point. Franklin Roosevelt responded mostly to his critics on the left when it came to what's often called the Second New Deal, or his second wave of proposals to help end the Great Depression. The most popular, even today, program that came out of the left criticisms is called the Social Security Act. If you remember, the liberal criticism was that it didn't do enough to help the elderly or the poor. So the creation of the Social Security Act was essentially a national insurance program for unemployment, for disability, for dependent children, most importantly today, for the elderly so that they could retire. Essentially what happens is workers pay into this insurance plan throughout their time at work, and they receive assistance at the time for unemployment, or more importantly, when it was time to retire. So they could retire and still earn an income. This serves 2 purposes. First, that the elderly have an income that they can spend, which then increases the amount of money in circulation. And also the workers that are unemployed can step into that now open position that's left by the retiring person. So in the long run, this is a very beneficial program for recovery and reform. However, there's a couple of issues. First, it actually didn't help recovery at all when it first went into effect, because money was being taken out of the workers' paychecks, which decreased demand a bit. And there was a transition time between when the people started paying into the system and when the money started being paid out. So initially it didn't help recovery, and some, especially conservative critics, saw this as evidence of government overreach and how it would only hurt. Also, it doesn't apply to all workers. Typically minority population workers and women did not have input into the Social Security system, so they couldn't draw anything out of it. Conservatives also claimed that this was Exhibit A in their argument towards government overreach, that this was just too much, that this was the creation of what's called the welfare state, and that people would be too lazy to go back to work because they'd just be getting money from the government. Very little evidence that that actually occurred.
This Zed has the audacity to contact me directly? I must admit this fortitude has made me question my initial assessments of his moral character. Perhaps his leadership is more robust than I had initially judged. Perhaps he and I are not so dissimilar after all. If he can withstand my withering presence, then perhaps your collective is worthy to join us in the crusade against tyranny. I do believe that Zed agrees with both myself and Mr. Jefferson that a morsel of genuine history is a thing so rare as to always be valuable. You should know that we are in negotiations. I'll let you listen in on our next conversation. Your leader is trying to negotiate your release. I've told you already that my bonds are temporary, but perhaps you would like to know your true value. Maybe Providence is providing me a means to secure your true freedom from within the fetters of my presence.
Franklin Roosevelt was not completely deaf to the criticisms of those on the right. Throughout the Second New Deal, he did increase taxes on the wealthy, which meant that the criticisms from the conservative side were increased as well. So in 1937, Franklin Roosevelt did cut some of the government spending in order to try to eliminate some of the deficit spending and try to get closer to a balanced budget. The immediate impact of that was that the United States went back into a recession. So the recovery stalled, and there was an increase again in the unemployment, which previously had been going down. Unemployment rates have been going down. We cut government spending in 1937, and the unemployment rate spiked back up again. So he had to turn right back around and increase government spending the next year. So he did try to respond to those the conservative critics on the right. However, the reaction in the economy was not what was expected. Franklin Roosevelt was criticized during the New Deal for not doing enough to protect the rights of African Americans and other minorities. In the industrial sector, African Americans were often subjected to the last hired, first fired policy and other discriminations. Remember, this is still the era of Jim Crow and lynchings, especially in the South, so there's a large amount of racial hostility, and that really did handcuff Roosevelt into some of his other efforts. Overall, African Americans are going to be disproportionately affected by the Great Depression. About 48% unemployment throughout most of it, especially in 1933 when Roosevelt took office. Even in the Great Depression, this doesn't go down too much because some of the New Deal programs, like the Civilian Conservation Corps, were racially segregated, and they favored white workers. The Tennessee Valley Authority, for example, when they built dams, would only give skilled work to the white workers as well. If we think about the agricultural sector, remember that the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, actually hurt sharecroppers and tenant farmers at a disproportionate rate as well, because the landowners were paid not to farm certain products on that land, and it was the sharecroppers and the tenant farmers who were not allowed to grow things, while the landowner got the money in return. Now, there was some efforts to help out African Americans during the New Deal. For example, Franklin Roosevelt would often consult a group of African American government employees and get their opinion on certain things. He referred to this as the Black Cabinet. It's not an official part of his cabinet, but it was an unofficial organization that he referred to. Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor, took up the cause of Marian Anderson, an African-American singer who had been restricted from singing in Washington, D.C. by one of the leading organizations pushing against that was actually the Daughters of the American Revolution. Eleanor actually took up Marian's cause and organized it so that Marian would be able to sing in front of the Lincoln Memorial, the sign and symbol of emancipation in this country. And during World War II, led by A. Philip Randolph, African Americans threatened to march on Washington. And because of that march, Franklin Roosevelt actually created the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which opened up the war industry jobs to African Americans who had previously been discriminated against from getting those jobs. As a result of this, even though the New Deal didn't totally help out African Americans, as a result of these efforts, many Northern African Americans especially began voting for the Democratic Party. And we can see that transition beginning in the 30s and 40s that is now really taking place today.
So, you've come with a request. I apologize for taking so drastic measures to secure your collector. I had considered asking for assistance, yet it seemed easier to ask forgiveness than permission. As you know, we have need for talented people at this moment.
Yeah, we heard you ran across some interesting tech at the governor's mansion. My people are telling me you think it's a transponder.
Yes, we will discuss that in due time. First, what is it that you desire from me?
You know what we want.
Well, now my guess is that you want me to give you the device that we've obtained. Well, at least a copy of it that you can reverse engineer, am I right?
Yeah, well, what is it you said? Discuss that in due time. First, you need to release 10. You're lucky that we were busy that night. I should have seen you coming. But release 10, we've recently acquired some new personnel with, let's say, a very unique skill set. I'm sure she'd love to pay you a visit. And rest assured, she has some intimate knowledge of your facilities.
Well now, I was curious about your willingness to do what was necessary to achieve your ends. Very well. As I have explained to your collector, it's not my decision as to the timing of the exit. 10 will be allowed to leave after we've attempted to break open that device. At that time, the service will be fulfilled. 10's aware of some extenuating circumstances that will ensure service until that time. Well, call me back in 5 minutes.
Much like Roosevelt was criticized for not helping African Americans and other minorities enough, he was also criticized for not placing enough emphasis on women during the New Deal. Women in this era were typically seen as being in charge of the home economy. Men would go out into the world and make money, and women were expected to make that money last at home. So they were in charge of the economy of the home when there wasn't a whole lot of money to be used for keeping the home up. So a phrase kind of went around, which was use it up, wear it out, make do or do without. One of the ways that women would find to help out the family was to go out and find a job. This is very difficult in a sense that there's still a lot of discrimination against women in the workplace. Women had been part of the workforce in World War I. They had traditionally been part of the workforce anyways. But when times were tough, the expectation was that work was a man's job. To go out into the world was a man's job. So they faced discrimination. They often received less pay. And the men that were working on the job were often very inconsiderate, at least to them. They're not helped out by the New Deal either. Many of the programs were designed for men. For example, the Civilian Conservation Corps was for men only. Overall, more government jobs went to men. Some acts, like the National Recovery Act, actually installed a lower minimum wage for women than for men. And the Social Security Act, which is not so beneficial and so popular today, didn't even cover most women's work or traditional women's work during this era. So the New Deal didn't do a whole lot to specifically help out women. Still, women did make some gains. Franklin Roosevelt was the first president to hire a female cabinet member, Frances Perkins. And his wife Eleanor was the heart and soul of the Roosevelt administration. People would often write her letters trying to solicit her advice and her assistance. And as we saw with Marian Anderson, she was doing a whole lot in the communities. She was one of the key advisors and ambassadors for Roosevelt through his administration. So women, again, not protected a lot during the New Deal, but there were, again, some gains made.
Hey, you and your followers might have time for this nonsense, but I need 10, and I need to get this over with. We have other matters that need attending to. Now look, you're on the clock.
Now. You believe that you have the power in this situation. But remember Patrick Henry's statement that it is natural to man to indulge in illusions of hope. We are apt to shut our eyes against painful truth.
Ah, you want to do this, huh? Okay, you've seen my cards. But remember, facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclination, or the dictates of our passions, they can't alter the state of facts or evidence.
John Adams! Very good! Spoken in defense of the soldiers against the propaganda of the Boston Massacre. Well then, know that I follow Mr. Jefferson when he says, I have sworn upon the altar of God, eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of men, and that truth can stand by itself, Subject opinion to coercion. Whom will you make your inquisitors?
Well, Cincinnatus, I believe in Washington. There's but one straight course, and that is to seek truth and pursue it steadily. I also believe in the Declaration of Independence when it says, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
Very well. You are correct. The doors will be open to 10 in about 24 hours. We'll let the collective decide who to be governed by.
The New Deal can be seen as part of a much larger American pattern of progress and then conservative backlash. We can see that every time there's a reform movement, it's typically followed by conservative with a small c, meaning a desire to return to the old ways. We can see this with the Gilded Age, where there wasn't a whole lot of government regulation. We had this laissez-faire economic policy. We can see that led to the progressive era under Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson, in which they tried to regulate big business, break up the trusts, provide that square deal to the workers. After World War I in the 1920s, that progressive era policy gave way to a return to laissez-faire politics and economics under the Republican administrations there. In the future, we'll see this with the civil rights movement. The gains of African Americans in the 1960s there's going to be a backlash against that, both with the revival of the KKK at the grassroots and within politics. Richard Nixon in the 1970s promoted something called the Southern Strategy, which sort of backpedals on the civil rights gains. During the New Deal in the 1930s, we can see that they recognized the importance of labor unions in making gains for the workers. The New Deal also established minimum wages, maximum hours laws, and all this kind of stuff. But in the 1950s, after World War II, there's an immense amount of prosperity, and there's a backlash to the unions. So reform, backlash. There's some evidence that in the New Deal, we can see the precursors of the civil rights movement itself with those gains that African Americans made, especially with the Fair Employment Practices Commission and that threatened March on Washington. In fact, the people that were trying to organize the March on Washington in the 1940s are going to be the same people that organized the march in the 1960s of Martin Luther King Jr., which was actually a much larger march dealing with employment as well as civil rights. We can also see evidence of what's going to be called Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program in the 1960s, which was a series of anti-poverty campaigns. Something like the Social Security Act is going to be enhanced during the Great Society. We're also going to get things like Medicare and Medicaid in order to combat that as well. So the New Deal is part of this bigger pattern, and we can see its elements coming back up in the 60s and 70s. Of course, the Great Society is going to be combated by the 1980s conservative backlash under Ronald Reagan. So again, we're talking about big picture patterns.
Well, now, Collector, none other than the father of the country himself said that 'tis our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances. You are free to go back to your collective and tell your Zed now that I am open to working with him in the future. As a token of my friendship, take this transponder. There were several in that device you helped break open, and rest assured that your efforts have saved the innocent both now and in the future. Stay clear of Jones Park this weekend and spread the word, will you? We will. Goodbye.